Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? I don't know what that's from. I think it's from Rush Hour, but every time I talk about our chapter 4, which is verbal communication, that's what I always think of. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you're excited for chapter 4. I believe there are 11 slides if you are keeping track. Today, we're going to be talking about what is language, perceptions of language, the power of language, types of language, and then how to improve your language or verbal communication skills. And there's a picture here, really happy people at work. And I think they're happy because they are all using strong verbal communication skills. I do. That's what I believe. All right, let's go. So what is language? I'm going to read this for the folks who are listening. Maybe they're not watching, which if you're multitasking, no worries. Our book refers to language as a system of human communication using a particular form of spoken or written words or other symbols. It's important to make that distinction. It's either people make this distinction or forget this distinction all the time. Even though we're talking about verbal communication, those are the words. Whether they are written or spoken, that's still verbal communication. Nonverbal communication is everything else, but again, even the written word is considered verbal communication. Our authors would talk about verbal communication as the most important element in human communication. I agree with that to some extent. I think all of it is important, but I think what they're getting at is oftentimes when we are planning conversations, important conversations with people, this is where people tend to put their time in planning is, how do I want to plan this message? What words will I use as opposed to how will I stand or where will I sit or what time of day? Those are all great things too, but often we tend to put our time into words. They also introduce us to a term called discourse, which is a spoken or written discussion of a subject. So you might hear that word if you haven't already. We're having a discourse, which just means a discussion about a particular topic. Perceptions of language. Words help create reality. They vary in abstraction and reflect an individual's attitudes about things. What that means is, not everybody knows what abstraction, for example, means. They help create reality, which again, depending on the words we use, people will understand something they didn't before. Vary in abstraction means sometimes we understand the words and sometimes we don't. And generally our words reflect our attitudes about things. There is something called meta communication, which means to communicate about communication. So easy enough. That's what we're doing here right now. I am meta communicating with you because I'm communicating about communication. I would also think of this, I have a counselor that I see regularly, and I don't mind telling people that because I find it very helpful. She's just a unbiased person who kind of problem solves with me all the time, but she refers to this as pre-communication, which means like if you're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody and you don't want them to get upset, like it's a parent or a partner, you might start with, hey, do you have a few minutes? I want to talk to you about something that that's really important to me. Or if you've already started talking about it, you can say, I'm going to share something that's really important to me. It's not meant to upset you, but I want to go ahead and talk about it because I think it's important. That would be meta communication. Meta messages is you can think about those as like diving into the the meaning conveyed beyond the words. So again, it's kind of thinking about the nonverbal communication. What tone was the person using or what posture? And you're really thinking about, when I put it all together, what does all of this mean? Then our book talks about the difference between denotative and connotative meanings. Denotative represents what you would find in a dictionary. So D is in denotative, D is in dictionary. Whereas a connotative are what's generally understood. It also will incorporate maybe an emotional impact. And I have a video here, but I don't know that the video will play as I'm showing as I'm shooting this video, but you can see what it's suggesting is there are certain words that we might use, like if we could say a crowd or a group of people, or we could say a mob of people. If I choose to use the word mob, I'm suggesting how I feel about that particular topic, right? And my understanding of mob could be different than your understanding of mob. That's when we have a connotative meaning of a word. If we use a word like group, it doesn't really suggest as much emotion, but usually we have a shared meaning, like based on the definition of, so that would be a good denotative. I'm not going to play this video, but I will try to remember to link it in the chapter so that you guys have these videos. Oops. I forget that it always wants to do that. So I don't know if that started or working for you guys or not, but in the interest of time, again, I'll link it for you. And the same is true with the next video. Oh, this is a really good one. As we talk about the power of language, we often have a bias. Most of us do, whether we're aware of it or not, but those are attitudes that are not objective, prejudiced, or offensive to others. The way this reads is maybe a little bit confusing, but a bias generally means that I think a certain way. Maybe I have a bias toward, let's say, snowbirds. I think they generally operate slower. Like if I'm walking behind them in the store, maybe I'm biased to think that all snowbirds, are slow walkers or something like that. I might not even be aware I have that bias. It just means I have a certain way of looking at things that could be offensive to other people. A bias that is attached to someone's sex, sorry, there's also like a little gnat in here, would be called sexism. And again, it's based on biological sex. So I think we're all familiar with, sexism that's happening in different spaces right now. But if you have a negative belief, it could be a positive belief. It's usually negative, though, about a certain person because of their sex, then we would think of that as sexism. And the same would be true with racism. If you have a bias or a negative thought, a prejudiced thought about somebody because of their race, that would be thought of as racism. And in this clip in Hidden Figures, I recommend that you watch it. It's not very long. I think it's like maybe 3 or 4 minutes. It's a really good scene about where she is when the main character, it's not Harrison Ford. Can't think of his name now. Kevin Costner. I was going to say the guy in The Bodyguard, but Kevin Costner. He's having a conversation with a woman who seems to be gone all the time. And she essentially is like, yeah, it's because I have to go half a mile to get to the restroom because there's no restroom for me in this building. Hadn't even crossed his mind. I mean, this is in the 60s, I think, or the 50s. So that doesn't give it a good excuse, but it's just a good example of sometimes we have biases and we don't even know that we have them. So I recommend watching that. In terms of types of language, we do have formal language. This is language certainly that would be used in a lot of workplaces just because it's a more formal environment versus, let's say, an informal language. It's more commonly used every day. I remember one time in my master's program, I went to a dinner at our department chair's house. Everybody went. And there was all these well-educated people or doctors, and I was just in a master's program, and I felt like they were fancy people. I wasn't really raised around fancy people, so that's probably why I thought that. And I just felt so, I guess, smart. And I was saying, oh, well, I don't use a lot of curse words. I never have, just for whatever reason. And I just said, I don't think they sound that great coming out of my mouth. And I just don't think they sound that great anyway. And at that time, the chair happened to be walking by, and she's like, I use them all the time because I think they're perfect. And I was like, oh, okay. There is a time and place for formal language and a time and place for informal language. Jargon is, I'm going to read it to you, but then I'll explain it. Specialized or technical language associated with a specific group or professional context that may not be understood by outsiders. Jargon just means words that you understand because you're part of a technical group. Let's say you work in IT. And so you guys throw around words like RAM and REM or ROM and I don't know, this processor and that modem and blah, blah, all these things. People who are not in the computer world or understand computers, it sounds like Charlie Brown language to them. It's jargon. We don't know what you're saying, but people in that specialized field do know. So it's usually specialized and it's usually technical. Could be also with doctors or attorneys or anything. I mean, in education, we have a lot of those jargon terms as well. A colloquialism is an informal expression used in casual conversation, specific to certain dialects or geographic regions around the country. So an example that we've used in class is something like y'all or bless your heart, something like that. And it's again, it's an expression that's used casually and is usually associated with certain groups or people. I'm going to pause this. This is a short reel that I'll link for you guys. But also when we're looking at types of language, we also have slang, which is similar to informal language. But this is sort of more common to very specialized groups. So I guess sort of similar to a colloquialism, but it's not necessarily like regional or geographical. So in this reel, there's a mom and a daughter, and they're talking about the differences in slang from what's probably my generation to I think like this 12-year-old girl's generation. And so we might have said, oh, he's got swagger, versus like maybe in your generation, you guys are calling it Riz. I realize when I say the words that you guys are familiar with, it sounds ridiculous, so I'm not going to go through the long list. But I learned some really good ones. Lately, I've learned standing on business, so I like that one. But that's a great example of slang. And again, I won't use any more so that you keep watching. Cliches are overused expressions that have lost their original meaning. So when people are like, oh, that's so cliche, that means like, come on, think of something original to say. That's played out. It's just too much. So a cliche might be something like, if I had a nickel for every time I heard that, things like that. I'm trying to think of a cliche you guys might be using, but you'll know if it's overused, then you'll know. It will be like, oh my gosh, stop using that. Oh, we'll just, yeah, drip. That's a good one. I had forgotten about drip. I don't remember how to use it in a sentence. Maybe you have a lot of drip. I don't know. Like, fantastic drip going on. Wonderful drip today. I don't know. This is why it's subculture related because I'm not in the culture to be using it. We have talked about also vulgarity as a type of language. Again, that's something that is often offensive to other people. What I would say about that is just be really mindful of your language around other people, because you might not think it's offensive, but they do. Cursing is a type of vulgarity. Again, I just talked about curse words. It's profane language. It talks about projecting evil, doom, or misfortune, but again, it could just be curse words. Biased language, again, if we talk about bias as like having a certain idea about certain people, then our language shows that bias when we're showing prejudice or favor for others or demeaning to others. That would be biased language. And then to put a spin on something means you manipulate the language to achieve the most positive interpretation of words, gain political advantage, or deceive others. So you might have heard people say, well, if you put that spin on it, then yeah, I guess it means something else. But it would be like if you and I had a disagreement about something, and let's say, I don't know, you submitted something and I didn't see that you submitted it. And so I was like, yeah, I can't accept it. And you were very adamant that you had submitted it and you had proof, but then I refused to accept it. And you're telling somebody else about it. You, instead of just talking about the facts, you might put a spin on it so that other people believe the story the way you wanted them to see it. That's what we mean by spin. We're manipulating a little bit. Sometimes it also could be exaggerating, but usually it's for the purpose of manipulating. We also have ambiguous language, which is, again, when we're trying to be unclear. So it's like, I didn't not go to the party. You didn't ask me if I went to this house. You asked me if I went to the party. Nope, I went to this house. So we're intentionally being confusing so that we, don't have an argument maybe with somebody. A euphemism is a way of saying something more politely or less bluntly. And so in this video, they're talking about some euphemisms. So instead of saying maybe somebody died, you might say somebody has passed on or moved on. It's a nicer way of saying things. Relative language is when we are trying to connect with other people intentionally. We're using our words to say, you know how it is. I know you also work and go to school, and so you're keeping busy too. That's our attempt to connect with people. A static evaluation is when we are showing things in people that things can't change over time. It's always going to be this way. It's never And as we talked in the last chapter about, happiness and changing our mindset, one of the suggestions is try to use a static evaluation when you're talking about good things. Like I watch a woman called Abraham Hicks, and she talks about these mantras, if you will, or self-affirmations. Things are always working out for me. This is going to be for my benefit. It always is. So a static evaluation when we're talking in the positive is really great. We want to try to avoid a static evaluation when we're saying nothing ever works out for me. People always cheat on me. That may or may not be true, but we don't want to put that in our brains. We don't want to put that in the universe because our brain likes to make us right. So if we believe that to be true, we're going to take actions that make that true. Versus if we're saying, yeah, things always work out for me. I might have a bump in the road right now or every now and then, but things are always working out. Our brain will start to believe that. Again, whoops, that's the example I was telling you about. He died or he passed on. And then lastly, we can think about ways to improve our communication skills with regard to verbal communication. We can be very clear, number one, about what we want. What do we need? A lot of times we don't do that. Two, I mentioned this earlier, consider your audience. We can't communicate with everybody the exact same way because different people have different needs. So we might have to use certain words with friends versus certain words with parents. Use nonverbal communication, I would say, to support your verbal message. So again, let's say you're trying to ask your parents for some money because you need help with your bills. Think about, with your nonverbals, you can also think about, what does your tone sound like? What does your volume sound like? Are you being calm? Are you being dramatic with your tone or overly expressive? Or are you demanding that they give you money? Based on the audience, we got to make choices as to what will be the most effective way to send our message. Breathing is always very helpful, of course, as you can imagine. Sometimes it helps to take a few breaths, focus on our breathing and calm ourselves down so that our emotions can settle and we can be a little more logical. And then actively listen. We talked about this as well. It's very easy for us to think about the next thing we're going to say, but if we miss what the other person said, our words might not even make sense. So it's important to really listen to what is being said and maybe what's not being said. So in this video, we've talked about what is language, perceptions of language, the power of language, and also types of language, as well as how to improve your verbal communication skills. I hope this video has been helpful and I can't wait to see your responses. Bye, everybody.